I was supposed to speak about globalization issues of nanotechnology, but that's a much bigger topic, and so I speak only on the small topic, a section of the topic on the impact of nanotechnology on the developing countries. Nanotechnology is a global phenomenon, and one of this phenomenon is the impact on developing countries. And do I move this here? No? Okay. Now, almost from the beginning, nanotechnology has been promised to meet the specific needs of developing countries. This is something which could be suspicious because these promises came from the industrialized countries. And since then, it has always been in the room, this kind of argument. Nanotechnology is, so to speak, a specific technology that improves the conditions for the poor countries. Now, of course, that is something which has an ethical aspect immediately, because technology is then is to be evaluated according to whether it increases or decreases the gap between the poor and rich country, and so the focus, the ethical focus, then will be on global justice or global inequity, or that will be my talk about. Now, it would seem to be useful to start with some definitions. I don't have the time to do this. Just the term developing countries is kind of strange because there are several countries who are called developing countries where the development state is actually worsening, whereas industrialized countries typically are developing countries. However, it's the term that has been introduced and used widely. I refer here to the Human Development Index by the United Nations Development Program that defines development in terms of the economy, health, and educational factors. It's the widely accepted index to describe it. So it's not only the focus on the economy, it's a broader focus to describe development. That's the brief outline of my talk. After this introduction, I will briefly tell you something about the diversity of nanotechnology, and then I suggest a framework to assess possible impacts of nanotechnologies. And then I address just 3 examples, because I will conclude in section 3 that it's impossible to answer the question, but you can give examples. And the 3 examples address sub-questions, so to speak, and those are: does nanotechnology meet the specific needs of the poor? And second, how can nanotechnology impact the existing economies of developing countries? And third, is nanotechnology a new industrial opportunity for developing countries? There are examples listing in parentheses about that. I have a very brief conclusion in this short talk. Now, the first thing to notice is that nanotechnology covers such a diverse field of different technology that it almost doesn't make sense to use the term nanotechnology in singular. Actually, there's so many different technologies, and they differ from country to country, and particularly they're growing from time to over years. More and more technologies, or to be more correct, research fields are included or covered by the term nanotechnology. That doesn't really make sense to speak of nanotechnology anymore. So this is just a list that I created about 4 years ago from taking the research fields that are covered in nanotechnology conferences or nanotechnology budgets. Now, of course, in looking at this question, how do these technologies have an impact on developing countries, each of the technology has to be assessed separately, right? That's one aspect of the problem. The other problem is, what does that mean, impact on a country? And in order to understand this kind of impact, one needs to consider the full life cycle of each technology. And we need to consider it particularly in social contexts, in the local context, but also in the global context. And so the suggestion, the analytical model I'm here trying to briefly sketch out is that we have to distinguish between different phases: the R&D planning phase, the R&D activity phase, the manufacturing phase, and finally the consumption phase. The complete picture is much more complicated, by the way. So just as a sketch, let's go through this. Now you are the Minister for Research and Technology in a developing country, and you want to make decisions. Now, for such developing countries, we usually have a small research budget. The investment can be very risky. Because you invest the small amount of money into one project, and if it turns out to be the wrong project, your money is gone. That's different in the big industrialized country where they can waste a lot of money on wrong decisions. Now, decisions can be misled, particularly in nanotechnology, for a lot of reasons. And the most important reasons, I think, are, first, the concept nanotechnology is totally unclear. Everybody's talking about and using kinds of definition. If you look closer at the definition, they don't work. They don't work for anything. Now, you have to make a decision, of course, then. Do you want to invest in this kind of unspecific nanotechnology, or do you want to invest in a very specific technology that you might want to call nanotechnology or not? The second danger is the hype that's around on these technologies. They're usually considered to be new, but if you look closer, most, if not all of them, are old. So nanotechnology comes frequently as old wine in new bottles. And so those countries have to look closer at what is really new and what is not new. And they have to look closer in patent databases, whether there are already monopolies of patent claims in certain areas or not. And then, of course, nanotechnology comes with all these huge promises. And the biggest promise is propagated by the National Science Foundation from its very beginning, from the start of the National Nanotechnology Initiative, was that it would lead to something like industrial revolution. As David Berube just showed, more than 80% of the public relates nanotechnology with the next industrial revolution. That's I've got from the slide here. Now, what does that mean? Does really somebody know what industrial revolution actually means? We had probably two of them. One was in the late medieval age in Europe, and the second in the 18th and early 19th century. And all this talk about industrial revolution creates hopes, creates expectations that are, as a rule, unfounded on wrong promises and the wrong understanding of what an industrial revolution actually is. It suggests that a country who invests some money into technology could shortly catch up with the rest of the world, and that's naive. So there are other problems. If you go to the actual research and development activities, it's obvious that developing countries have little previous experience in the research. They have, by that reason, poor regulations for research and for development. And that, of course, then poses risks for both scientists and the larger populations. Risks for researchers, of course. If you have a long tradition, let's say, in experimental chemistry, then you have experience in dealing with toxic substances. Same technology and experience, same safety technology and the same experience can be used dealing with nanoparticles. If you don't have this experience, it's a problem for these people. And then, of course, there's the old problem that people in developing countries are used as guinea pigs. There are differences in the wages, differences in regulations, and the public media attentions of scandals are things that are all insensitive for industrialized countries to make poor individuals the guinea pigs for their research and development. That's a particular problem for medical research, for the clinical trials. And if you go to the manufacturing, the actual manufacturing state, it's important to make a lot of distinctions here, because a developing country can be the manufacturer or can be the consumer of a product or can be the provider of certain aspects for the manufacturing, like the materials or the know-how or the waste processing. It's a very complex state, so to speak, the state of manufacturing. And in each of these roles, a country can benefit from it or can be harmful for this country. And here I'm listing just 3 examples you all might know. That the manufacturing carries, of course, the risk of environmental pollution, uncertain worker safety and hazards. That's not totally new, and it's the case for nanotechnologies for sure. A case I will discuss later a bit more in detail is the question of the materials economy, because many developing countries are raw materials supplier. New technologies can suddenly change the demand for materials. And so if you build your economy in exporting mining and exporting metals of a certain kind, technology can undermine the whole economy. And finally, which is a big problem since several decades, the waste processing. So many developing countries are engaged in this. They have become the dumping places of the industrialized world. Now, you can do this in a more clever way. However, it's short-sightedly perform the waste processing, and if it's done at low regulation standards, then it obviously consumes environmental resources, so it's short-sighted, and it threatens public health. And finally, on the consumption state, everybody might think that it's just fine if you have this nanotechnology product and everybody can consume it, we are all happy. But it's more complicated. Consuming this product, as any technological products, can have negative impacts on society. For instance, there are examples. It can create a trade deficit or a dependence on the country that produces the products if the products need to be imported. Right? If there's only an elite that is able to benefit from the product, then consuming the product increases local inequality. And third, since technology usually is aimed at improving some conditions of life, it always comes with some ideas, some normative ideas of what a good life is. And as such, the products itself import values. Now, if the values that are incorporated, so to speak, in the products support certain life forms that are not valued in the importing society, it creates problems, value problems, some of which can be very drastic. So all this affects the question, how does nanotechnology have an impact on developing countries? And it's a more general framework for assessing the impact of countries in general, of technologies on countries in general. Now, it's obvious that there is no simple answer to the question. We have to look at all the technologies, and this is just a short list. It can be twice or 4 times as long, the list on the one hand, different technologies. And then you have to look at the different phases of the research and development and each of the aspects I just mentioned. So you have hundreds of research projects if you want to answer the question, how do nanotechnologies impact the developing countries? So I won't give answers to this question. However, I will present a few cases just to illustrate how sometimes superficially the questions have been dealt with. This is just one example, maybe from 2005, I think it's from 2005, which tries to answer the question, does nanotechnology addresses the specific needs of poor countries? And one specific need of the poor countries is AIDS prevention. It's a huge problem. It's the worst global pandemic ever since medical history has been recorded. And it affects mainly people in sub-Saharan Africa. And so at, I think, 2004 or 2005, a small Australian company came up with dendrimers, certain molecules. You have images of them on the right side. And they promised that these molecules would be the nanotechnology remedy against the world's worst epidemic. And the argument was that this kind of substance could be used as vaginal microbicides. And the nanomedia picked up this idea and celebrated nanotechnology as the remedy for the AIDS problem. Now, if you look closer, it's very simple. There are lots of problems, and I'm just pointing on the tip of it. I'm just starting with a quote from the UNAIDS organization from 2006. Quote, "The steady growth of the AIDS epidemic stems not from the deficiency of available prevention strategies, but rather from the world's failure to use the highly effective tools at its disposal to slow the spread of HIV." So if you look closer at the AIDS problem, as almost any problem that seemed to be solved by nanotechnology, it turns out that the problems are not technological problems. They're mostly social problems that require social and particularly political solutions rather than the latest high-tech. Now, if you look at the dendrimers, they cost several thousand US dollars per gram. It's amazing that this could ever have been proposed as a remedy for the poor countries, for developing countries. They will never be available to the poor people. And if you look at what other kinds of remedies, what other kinds of microbiocides are developed at different clinical states, you find simple things like soap or lime juice that appear to be quite effective, and certainly more effective at this extremely expensive dendrimer. Well, soap might be called nanotechnology because soap creates nanolayers, but nobody does so, right? And that's a problem. Now, addressing the second question, how can nanotechnology impact the existing economies of developing countries? We do have a longer tradition of changing material demands through new technological innovations, particularly through synthetic chemistry. For instance, synthetic dyes replaced natural dyes, synthetic niter replaced niter, or plastics replaced wood, or other materials which each had an impact on the economies of developing countries in earlier times. Now we have nanotechnology, and here particularly the materials science fields that all try to develop new materials which, if you look closer, many of them trying to replace natural or expensive or foreign materials that still today need to be imported, mostly from developing countries. I'm going to give you two examples. One is catalysis. It's one of the declared goals of the US National Nanotechnology Initiative to develop catalysts that have replaced the precious metals. It's a huge amount of money that's spent into catalysts. I'm just giving you here the numbers of the platinum market. It's about $6 billion. It's mostly mined in South Africa. The economy of South Africa depends on it. It's almost 3% of the gross domestic product. That's only one example. There are lots of other metals which are mined in South Africa. Now, if somebody in a laboratory makes this ingenious discovery of a cheap catalyst, this will ruin the economy of South Africa. And by that, it will be a disaster for the whole political disaster also for the whole region over there. Another example would be tungsten. I don't have the time to go into this. Now, the third question is nanotechnology unique industrial opportunities for developing countries? And here, I'm not going into details here. The question is more interesting to look at in general because nanotechnology or nanotechnological research and development happens at a time now where we have, during the past 20 years, quite a lot of changes in the legislation and in the practice dealing with intellectual property rights. And there are particularly three trends which are important, which all have the same effect because they move basic engineering knowledge from the public domain to the market based on the ideas of a knowledge economy. And actually we are seeing that monopolies are built up. So these three trends, which all were initiated, by the way, from the US, are first, the liberalization of criteria for patent eligibility. Most of what's today patented would not have been possible to patent in the 70s, for instance. Now we have changing intellectual property practices at the universities. Researchers are no longer able to decide whether they publish their results in a journal or as a patent. The university administration does that, and usually patents or licenses, exclusive licenses, are given to local startups. And third, there is the TRIPS agreement, which requires that all members of the World Trade Organization should observe the intellectual property rights, including the poorest countries who would, by some copying, solving their problems. Now, all these trends are increasing the limit for the poor countries at the periphery to get access to the knowledge that would in the older times would have been accessible for them and could have been used for them to solve their specific problems. So, is nanotechnology a unique industrial opportunity for developing countries? Well, under these conditions, definitely not, because it protects the kind of industrial landscape we have. It conserves it and doesn't provide new opportunities for developing countries. Now, brief conclusions. Although the three examples I've addressed were negative, the general answer is open. The impact of nanotechnology in developing countries is very complex. It needs to be assessed in detail, and I've tried to sketch this out. You can develop thousands or hundreds, at least, of case studies for each technology under each of these aspects I've described. What we have is we have all these optimistic promises that usually try to promote nanotechnology in general. It's quite an interesting media phenomenon, by the way, that global justice has become kind of a rhetorical strategy to point out the goodness of something. In this case, the goodness of nanotechnology. However, if you look closely, all these kinds of optimistic promises typically ignore the actual social context and misconceive the actual problems. And finally, wow. And this is something which, although it has no legal binding, it's not a convention in the sense as Jürgen presented us the conventions. It is a universal declaration on bioethics and human rights from 2005 by UNESCO. And here, interestingly, I mean, all the member states of UNESCO have signed this. And here, Article 15 states that benefits resulting from any research, scientific research and its applications should be shared with society as a whole and within the international community, in particular with developing countries. Thank you very much.